So, dear friends, we will start our first session of our today's webinar, and it will be consecrated to a question of Bergson and Anglo-American evolutionary theories. So, our first lecturer is Bruno Reids. Bruno Reids is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Philosophy at University of São Paulo. And as I see, in several months, he will publish his first book with the title The Expressions of Life, Nature and Culture in Bergson's Philosophy. Yes. So please, Bruno, you can start.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Povilas. So I'll read a text and then start. Okay. So while commenting the difference, are you listening to me? Do you hear me?
Yes, yes.
No, okay.
It's okay. It's okay.
While commenting the difference between vertebrates and invertebrates, Bergson states in Creative Evolution that the body of the anthropods, formed by a more or less long series of juxtaposed rings, divides the motor activity into a variable number, sometimes considerable, of appendices in which each has its specialty. Their movements, therefore, although complex, are limited, since the cohesion of the activities that are distributed by the joints of the body restricts its capacity to vary them. Such fit between function and form find its perfection in the order of Hymenoptera, sawflies, bees, wasps, and ants, making them, so to speak, the guardians of instinct. Invertebrates, on the other hand, the activity is concentrated on two pair of limbs, reason for the liberation of the function in related to the form. Fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals present, each in their own way, the virtues of handling. With them, intelligence is born, the specific attribute of vertebrates, as Bergson puts it 2 years later in the review made to the book The Birth of Intelligence, La Naissance de l'Intelligence, written by Georges Bonne, an ancient student of the French geologist Alfred Gaudry. By distinguishing instinct and intelligence in terms of motor skills, Bergson seems to be inspired by the paleontologist Nathaniel Southgate Shaler, mentioned a few times in Creative Evolution. Professor of geology at Harvard and protégé of the eminent French-Swiss biologist based in US, Louis Agassiz, which in turn had been a student of Georges Cuvier and Alexander von Humboldt in Paris. Shaler's more theoretical works try to reconcile, from a scientific point of view, natural history with theology, besides devoting various analyses to the problem of man's place in nature. Like Bergson, Shaler understands that limbs are the instruments of the will, it's Shaler's expression. A fact that will assume in unimaginable dimensions with the human species, for whom the independence becomes complete, since, and I quote Bergson, hand is capable of any kind of work, end of quotation. In The Individual, the study of life and death, published in 1902, Shaler writes, and then I quote Shaler. In the greater animal, there is but one pair of instruments of progression, the legs, which give but little speed, the other pair of limbs being devoted to the special uses of the will. But for the execution of these intellectual purposes, the arms and hands are, except when they are provided with artificial tools, of little service, save in climbing, for which purpose they have been somewhat specially modified. As for the hand itself, it is, when unarmed, a very feeble instrument. It cannot strike a blow to be compared with the sting of a bee in effectiveness, size being taken into account. Much has been said in praise of the structure of the hand, but it is in itself of little value for any particular organic purpose except in cleaning the body, until the creature it serves came to the state where it began to use at first sticks and stones, and later the more elaborate utensils of the various arts. Then he came to serve as no other appendage does, as a universal tool holder, essentially like the chucks of lathe, which are so arranged that they may clutch any form of cutting instrument and guide it in its work. End of quotation. It is not, therefore, exactly the shape of the hand that is responsible for the complete freedom of form. It's the ability to infinitely vary the use of instruments that guarantees the freedom for humanity, or, to use Shaler's own words, its emancipation, as put it in another book, also quoted by Bergson, The Interpretation of Nature from 1893. How do not recognize in Shaler's words a well-known passage of creative evolution related to the Homo faber that states that intelligence, considered in what seems to be its original feature, is the faculty of manufacturing artificial objects, especially tools to make tools, and of indefinitely varying the manufacture. Such enthusiasms for the emancipatory potential technology, potential of technology, however, was linked not only to claims of a scientist with a more speculative inclination, and Bergson's decisive mention of the discoveries of Jacques Boucher de Perthes is a good way to approach the problem. The French archaeologists had discovered in the Moulin-Quignon quarry in northern France certain materials that looked like hatches, even though they could have such shape accidentally. Finally, these discoveries turned out to be false from the point of view of the date claimed by Boucher de Perthes. Although his work as an archaeologist, which included other discoveries such as pictorial inscriptions of elephants and rhinos in Manchancourt, for example, has validated him the title of the founder of prehistory studies. With the extension of human time towards the ages, much older than we imagined, it is not only man's past that must be reinterpreted, but also his present. Through archaeology, the historical discipline gains unprecedented breadth, with new chronological indicators impossible to be ignored by those who intend to provide a temporal narrative about mankind. History was not anymore a specific thread of literate civilizations. These now have to be understood in relation to pre-literate times, whose traces looked more like fossils that, by their turn, have to be understood in relation to the history of life and the history of Earth. And most importantly, if, as Bergson writes, the appearance of man on Earth coincides with the manufacture of the first weapons, the first tools, human history comes to be understood as the history of the progress of technical inventions. According to creative evolution, we shouldn't take as historical parameter the French or the American Revolution, the Battle of Austerlitz, or even the Franco-Prussian War, just to name a few examples that afterwards will be important to Bergson. Instead, it is the invention of the steam engine, symbol of the Industrial Revolution, the great historical event that would serve as the epitome of our time. It is not by chance, therefore, that there is in creative evolution an explicit inspiration in Paulo, one of the founders of the Longue Durée historical school. In his History Considered as Science, Histoire considérée comme science, the French historian is emphatic when relating technical inventions to human progress, precisely through the capabilities of the hand. Language, fire, the domestic animal implant, writing and register machines like the printers, all this machinery, according to Lacan's words, as artificial projections of the natural body, would constitute the motor of civilization, history, and humanity itself. But after the publication of Creative Evolution, the enthusiasms for the wonders of technology as an extension of life's creativity gradually gives way to the emergency of a moral dimension of the problem, attenuating the thesis that linked moral and material emancipation. In an interview with Joseph Lott in 1911, the uneasiness of that time is expressed by Bergson as a kind of discredit of the ideal caused by the successive attacks of materialism, both theoretical and practical, science and industry, which from the second half of the 19th century gained proportions never seen. At a certain point of the conversation, Bergson says to the interviewer, and I quote Bergson, "What characterizes our time is obviously a depression, a weakening of the ideal. The 19th century will be the materialistic century. The enormous, exaggerated, unexpected development of the new industrial techniques makes its effects felt. The effects in such cases are never immediate. It is today that we feel them. All of our materialism comes from there. But there are signs that make me believe that we are going out of it, and we have started going out." This is exactly three years before the war. It was on January 10, 1914, on the eve of the World War I, in the opening speech of the presidency of the Academy of Moral and Political Sciences, that Bergson will enunciate the normative dimension to which he would face the decay brought about by the unrestrained advances of materialism. It was the moment to restore the balance, he states. But what was the imbalance? Understanding that scientific progress materialized itself in technical inventions and that these, in turn, represented the peculiar way in which mankind handles instruments, Bergson will recover the original etymological sense of organ, and will say, etymological sense of tools, it will be organ, and will say that the unparalleled achievements in that field in the last century would symbolize a hypertrophy of the human body that, although beneficent, should be balanced. As a counterpart, it was imperative that the other organ of man, the soul, should develop to the point of adjusting such a disproportion. Only the strengthening of the moral sciences will be up to such duty. The creative direction of human progress, linked to the adventures of the invention of life and marked by contingency and novelty, seems no longer to satisfy the philosopher-biologists of before. A theory of history and the normativity that is attached to it will present major theoretical challenges and perhaps, even more importantly, will bring unthinkable consequences from a practical point of view. After conjecturing a fundamental link based on moral man and even social, that will put historians, economists, lawyers, moralists, and philosophers, putting them promptly at the center, which is in both cases the human soul, Bergson declares to his colleagues of the Academy, so I quote Bergson, "Never do moral and political science had such need to provide mutual support. Never has humanity counted on them so much. The main effort of modern science since its origins has been based on mathematics, mechanics, astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology. For 3 centuries, there were theoretical discoveries that made us penetrate the secrets of matter. Then came the applications. Inventions were added to the discoveries. In less than 100 years, mankind has walked into this direction more than it had traveled since its origins. Over the past century, its instrumental outillage has been perfected more than it had done during the last 1,000 years. If we consider that each instrument, utile, each new machine is, for us, a new organ. An organ is not etymologically also an instrument, a tool. It is noted that what truly increased in this brief interval is the man's body. But did his soul, I speak of the individual soul and the social soul, simultaneously acquire the supplement of strength that was needed to govern this suddenly and prodigiously enlarged body? And the extraordinary problems that we face today, were they not born in large part from this disproportion? Our sciences, the moral sciences, were tasked with restoring balance. The test is great and beautiful, and the future of humanity undoubtedly depends on the way in which it will be accomplished. End of quotation. According to Bergson, not only an automatic association between the development of science and the development of moral didn't exist, there was also an inverse relationship between them, between the two. To him, the First World War, with its dangerous alliance between industrialism and militarism, would have shown that the technique progress had been disproportionate, resolving thus the regress of morale, as he puts in his speech also for the Academy in January 24, 1918. But the insertion of the explicitly axiological dimension in certain theses that were, at least in intention, devoid of valuation, creates, as expected, some embarrassments. Surprisingly, at a certain point of the so-called war speeches, so the speeches that he gave during the war, in January 16, 1915, the philosopher of duration opposes the moral and the material through the opposition between eternity and becoming. The reason for this association lays in the fact that the material progress of civilization would not even be able to guarantee the intended force, since it would only aim to, I quote, assemble mechanisms, and a mechanism, however powerful it may be, ends its operation as it is used, end of quote. Left adrift, its energy vanishes, as well as the work that engages its gears. The movement of the machine is transitory. Nothing is more distinct for moral energy, and I quote, which endures to the end and defies time, end of quote. And another quote, nourishes itself with an eternally living ideal, constantly revivifying itself, and without ceasing, it also remakes its organized instrument as a soul that would reconstitute its body, end of quotation. If in 1907, the creation of life was conquered through the inorganic world, now morality shows itself capable of creating an inexhaustible energy without matter, contradicting not only created evolution, but also the content of a letter, written at the same time to his friend and translator, the British philosopher Herbert Wildon Carr, at the end of 1914, in which is conceived the possibility that I quote, a purely psychic energy could increase, even if, without a doubt, in an excessively restricted measure, end of quote. But if it's true that it is a congenital inclination to man and ultimately to life, or the instrumentalization of nature, it is worth mentioning some moments of this process throughout history. The end of the 18th century, initiating the era of mechanical inventions in great industry, and the 19th century, in which such initiatives gain an unimaginable proportion, are privileged periods in the eyes of our philosopher, and apparently are in the origins of the crisis that Bergson himself experienced in his time. Shattered by the technology of war, the moment of the 20th century had arrived to focus its efforts on what had been left in the shadows in the previous centuries. That is, it was time to prioritize psychological, moral, social things, and more generally, the spirit, and leave the things of matter aside. After the war in 1919, the latest version of Life and Consciousness will reverberate such considerations, and the changes in its new edition were possibly made also under the influence of the incipient work of the International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation, confirming the confession to Contessa Murat in 1924 in a letter that, in spite of being tied to a gear of occupations in which some would have only a distant relation to philosophy, perhaps such an extension of the experience would be of some use in the domain of philosophical speculation. End of the letter. The biggest change in the version of Life and Consciousness presented in Mind Energy in 1919, in relation to its first version from 1911, is possibly the articulation between vital progress and social progress. to the point that Bergson asserts that the result of evolution is social life. I quote, as if some original and essential aspiration of life could only find its full satisfaction in society. End of quotation. Such a state of affairs partially contradicts some considerations about society theorized in creative evolution, where Bergson understands that, I quote, there is no particular impulse to social life, but only a general movement of life, end of quotation. The link between society and life becomes more articulated and at the same time more spiritualized, in as much as its purpose is not only social action, as it was themed in 1907, in the sense that our social life revolves around the use and manufacture of artificial instruments. It's Bergson's expression. Instead of technical creations, what was at stake were moral creations, led by the heroism of certain men who revealed the metaphysical truth, is his expression, which has already appeared timidly in the war speech of April 1915 in the figure of French soldiers. In fact, individuation and integration, personality and community, individuality and sociability are inseparable when we think of human progress. In the last version of Life and Consciousness, Bergson writes, and I quote, society, which is the community of individual energies, benefits from the efforts of all its members and renders effort easier to all. It can only subsist by subordinating the individual. It can only progress by leaving the individual free. Contradictory requirements, which have to be reconciled. With insects, the first condition alone is fulfilled. The societies of ants and bees are admirably disciplined and united, but fixed in an invariable routine. If the individual is forgotten in the society on its part also has forgotten its destination. Individual and society, both in a state of somnambulism, go round and round in the same circle, instead of moving straight for the greater social efficiency and a completer individual freedom. Human societies alone have kept full in view both the ends to be attained. Struggling among themselves and at war with one another, they are seeking clearly by friction and shock to round off the angles, to wear out antagonisms, to eliminate contradictions, to bring about that individual wills should insert themselves in the social will without losing their individual form, and that different and diverse societies should enter in their turn into a wider and more inclusive society, and yet not lose their originality or their independence. This spectacle is both disquieting and reassuring, for we cannot contemplate it without saying that here too, across innumerable obstacles, life is working both by individualization and integration to obtain the greatest quantity, the richest variety, the highest qualities of invention and effort. End of quotation. The idea is presented in other terms in the same year in the Conference of the Human Soul, given in Strasbourg, where it is affirmed that the inexhaustibility of moral strength in the face of the constancy of physical strength. It is at the same conference that the concept of imbalance between investigations about nature and spirit reappears, now characterized by, I quote, the greatest fact in the history of mankind. The consequence of the enormous evolution of the positive sciences since the second half of the 19th century is again interpreted by the thesis of the disproportion between the two progress, although the regress is not only symbolized by the war, but by social and political problems, among which war will make the most dramatic chapter. With the invention of numerous machines, I quote, humanity enlarged its body beyond all proportions, while the soul remained what it was, much smaller in comparison. There was a flagrant disproportion between matter and spirit, and this is where the most serious social and political problems were born. In place of societies of spiritual beings, we had mechanized peoples, made the 20th century become the century of moral societies, And this mechanized peoples, he used the same expressions to refer to German people during the First World War. In the text reading for the Nobel Prize for Literature, for which Bergson is awarded in 1929, the thesis of the disproportion taken by the body through machines and the need for the expansion of the soul occupies almost the entire discourse. On this occasion, Bergson adds the examples of steam and electricity with a strong critical tone, contrasting with the excitement towards the steam engine in creative evolution. The application of such discoveries, even producing a huge reduction in distances through faster means of transport, like railways, and etc., and communication, and thus providing a greater physical connection, was not able to promote a moral connection between people, as prophesied by several Victorian British thinkers and French Republicans and liberals. But it is in July 1921 that answers seem to appear at the horizon. In a letter to Richard Burden Haldane, a Scottish philosopher and influential politician, Bergson will know the fact that he has always sought to privilege the positive character of intelligence, and not, as Haldane believed, the attributes missing in it. While characterizing the intelligence by what it is and not by what is not, he writes, intelligence was made by nature to help us in the struggle for life, end of quotation. Although the phrase struggle for life synthesized the vocabulary of evolutionary theories, and despite the intimacy of our philosopher with this line of thought, he had never used it in this way throughout his writings. He used once in laughter, but it's in a different sense. Why then use it now? When employing the old evolutionary motto for the first time, Bergson seems to point beyond what will be a common correction to the interpretation of a correspondent. To state that intelligence struggles for life means much more than to emphasize its operative function and scientific efficiency. In fact, such declaration points to a change of direction, which will only be fully explored in 1932, namely the idea that man as a species presents, in addition to a cognitive dimension, a moral dimension that was given to him by nature. Previously conceived to a large extent as a practical epistemic tendency, intelligence is now questioned from its most fundamental moral aspirations. Are not the altruistic and selfish affections at the basis of this struggle mentioned by Bergson? It is not by chance, therefore, that he rehabilitates the concept of common sense, considering it once again as something that aims not the manipulation of objects, but the promotion of interpersonal relations, with the difference that in the two sources of morality and religion, common sense is understood as a social sense innate to human species. Such questions touched on a problem faced by some of Bergson's evolutionist colleagues, related to the insufficiency of the struggle for life if considered exclusively in its individual dimension. It is not rare, for example, the cases that communitarian behaviors benefit individuals, while individualistic actions harm them, making it very difficult to establish a clear distinction between the individual and society. The exposition of this insufficiency is made by the American evolutionary psychologist and Bergson's friend, James Mark Baldwin, who, in his Darwin and Humanities, maintains that, I quote Baldwin, the psychological unity is a socius, a more or less socialized individual, fitted to enter into fruitful social relations, end of quotation. In 1913, in an enthusiastic review of Baldwin's book, Bergson accurately describes the second dimension of his friend's argument, which sought to dispel the failure of Darwinian individualism, by explaining the idea of duty. And I quote Bergson, every society is a set of socio, the expression that Baldwin used, which are at the same time spontaneously and voluntarily rule over each other. If therefore we refer to vital competition in sociology, it must be said that it is between groups, not between individuals, that the struggle of life occurs. The more the cohesion within the group, the more the group will be able to compete with others. To be effective, the struggle must precisely group the soci into an organization of individuals dominating and governing themselves. End of quotation. In the two sources of morality and religion, and man also is part and parcel of society. He and it are absorbed together in the same task of individual and social preservation. More specifically, this problem reappears in a more underlined way when Bergson discusses the idea of sociability, whose origin or mere tendency can be found in the cellular aggregates that make the individual already a society. Thus, society is once again understood as organization, as it were in 1907 in Creative Evolution, marked by specialization, division of labor in efficiency. That is, assuming, I quote, coordination and generally a subordination of the elements to each other, end of quotation, as occurs, for example, in cell constitution. However, despite the repetitions of such themes, the focus now in 1932 seems to be not the distinction between the organic and the inorganic, and the consequent refusal of cellular atomism, but the establishment of a tension that marks the collectivity and the individuality in the levels of societies already formed. And it is the case of insect societies and human societies. It is the sociability in these groups in their most complete forms that will interest our philosopher. That is, if the tendency of sociability is a fact, I quote, it is merely a tendency. And if we wish to deal with fully complete societies, clear-cut organizations of distinct individuals, we must take the two perfect types of association represented by a society of insects and a human society. End of quote. In the case of human groups, the term society will gain even greater specifications, since they are not even elementary associations, such as a family or other small groups. Distancing from the point of view of these conglomerates, Bergson will be interested in associations whose purpose are to insert themselves in an organized way in the struggle for life. Our philosopher will deal with associations prepared for war, or organized for war, as he states. Another aspect that we touched briefly above and that should be emphasized is that now, as in Creative Evolution, Bergson is interested in these two models, in two social models, the one proper to insects and the human model. And for the same reason as before, these are the most finished form of instinct intelligence, which in turn are the two tendencies that were formed through the relationship of life with inanimate matter. The investigation of 1932 starts, therefore, from the evolutionary perspective developed in 1907, where instinctive societies are marked by cohesion and rigidity, while intelligent societies by disintegration and progress. Bergson emphasizes, in the case of the former, its immutable character due to the constitution of its individuals. The existence of each ant, of each bee, has in view the existence of the anthill and the hive. In the case of human societies, their changing character is related to the place that individuals occupy in social tissue. Let us remember, however, that more deeply, such forms of social organization were directly indebted to the relationship that each vital tendency established with the instruments, with the tools. Although he continues to be an exponent of the projection theory, that is, that the tools are continuations of human organs, Bergson adds a new dimension aligned with the change of direction of his theory that we mentioned above. It is as if the natural disposition of human species for manufacturing instruments, or as creative evolution states, manufacturing artificial objects, especially tools to make tools, and of indefinitely varying the manufacture, had absorbed group competition and the struggle for life. When manufacturing tools, men started to possess them, thus making them their property. And since the tools are separated from the body that makes them, distinct, as we have seen, from certain insects, whose instruments, artificial organs, coincide with the natural organs, their possession must also presuppose in man the possibility of their loss, that is, the possibility of being taken by someone else. Contrary to a certain extent to the unconditional defense of man's creative vocation, Bergson will infer that, I quote, "It's easier to take the tools ready-made than to make them," end of quotation, attributing an unprecedented ambivalence in the theory of projection. If man creates, his creation, once made property, become the object of dispute, thus leading to a situation of conflict, that is, of war. According to Bergson and to sources, the tools, I quote, are meant to act at some specific matter, meant to be used for hunting or fishing, for example. The group of which he is a member may have fixed its choice on a forest, a lake, a river. Another group may find it more convenient to settle in the very same place than to look further afield. There is now nothing for it but to fight the matter out. We have taken the case of a hunting forest or a lake for fishing. It may just as well be a matter of fields to be cultivated, women to be seized, slaves to be carried off. In the same way, reasons will be brought forward to justify such dealings. But no matter that the thing taken, the motive adduced, the origin of war is ownership, individual or collective. And since humanity is predestinated to ownership by its structure, war is natural. End of quotation. And then just to finish my conclusion, such investigations, however, should not obscure the philosopher in the pursuit of the forms a society can eventually take, that is, of its virtual forms. Since, as the title of the 1932 work says, morality has two sources. It can be open or closed, which gives rise to thinking that the passage from the former to the second would represent the passage from nature to human, or at least the indication of a certain abandonment of nature. But is that really what this is about? A first step towards overcoming this problem is to interrogate it under other terms. In the form of a question, it would be as follows. How do living beings, and notably human beings, naturally social, survive? And what is their aspiration so that they can live better? To survival, Bergson will give name of closed society or morality, linked, as we have seen, to the struggle for life. To happiness, he will refer to an open society or morality. Finally, how humanity can overcome is a state of survival, of just living, and reach the joy and love that comes from simplicity of life. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bruno, for your nice conference. And now we will pass to our second lecturer, Mathilde Tahar. She is a doctoral research at the Toulouse University, Jean Jaurès, and at the National Museum of Natural History in Paris. So, Mathilde, please.
Thank you. I actually tried something. It's my very first PowerPoint, so I'm sorry about it, but I'm actually really proud I made it. So I'm going to share a screen. I'm going to try. Do you see it or is it working?
Yes, yes, we see it. Very nice.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to talk back about the Bergsonian interpretation of Darwin theory. Bergson offers an epistemological critique of Darwin theory focusing on variation. In Darwin's view, variation is accidental. It's natural selection that shapes adaptation by favoring organisms that carry advantageous variations. What Bergson refutes is Darwin's gradualism. For Darwin, the variation is minute, and Bergson glosses insensible. He even speaks of the Darwinian theory of insensible variations. His argument is that if variations are insensible, they can't confer any advantage and that therefore be selected. Bergson refers to a section of The Origin of Species where the formation of the eye is explained by the selection of, I quote Darwin, extremely slight and gradual variations. However, for Darwin, the written variations are by no means insensible. They must, I quote Darwin again, represent an improvement natural selection will pick out. So where does such a semantic shift come from? This can't be just a clumsiness, since Bergson uses this expression 5 times, and it's his main argument against Darwinism. My hypothesis that I will present is that Bergson's interpretation was influenced by Albert d'Astre, who in a 1903 article raises several objections to Darwinism, and mainly that Darwin, I quote d'Astre, brings out the considerable change that creates a new species from insensible ones. d'Astre refers to St. George Mivart, who also bases his critique of Darwin on the impossibility of selecting an insensible variation. Mivart uses a range of examples, including the formation of the eye in terms that strongly recall those of Bergson a few years later. So I'll try to trace the history of this false paradox that transformed the slight variation upon which natural selection acts into insensible ones that by definition can't be selected. And first, I'll analyze Bergson's misunderstanding of Darwin. Then I'll see the article of d'Astre and the text of Mivart that he talks about. And finally, I'll analyze the counterexample of the Becton Maximus to show that despite Bergson's misinterpretation, he points to actual limits of Darwin theory. So, Bergson's purpose in creative evolution is to reveal the inadequacy of the mechanistic explanations to account for evolution. In these explanations, I quote Bergson, evolution must have occurred through a series of accidents added to one another, each new accident being preserved by selection if it's advantageous to the organism. But in this hypothesis, it's highly unlikely that two very different series of accidents will lead to similar results. And it's by demonstrating the existence of this improbable fact that Bergson intends to discredit these explanations, which for him include Darwinism. Bergson refers to the these eyes of the Becton Maximus, which would present what Bergson calls an analogy of structure with the human eye. It's the same organ structured in the same way, appearing on divergent genealogies. The eye of the Becton would have the exact same structure as that of our eye up to the retinal inversion. But mollusks and vertebrates separated from their common parent stem long before the appearance of an eye so complex as that of the Becton. Whence then the structural analogy, asks Bergson. So Darwin explained the homologies of structure in two species, the same structure inherited from a common ancestor. There was also talk at the time of analogies of function, organs with the same functions in divergent lineages. But according to Bergson, none of the theories under debate can explain the analogies of structure. And that's what he attempts to demonstrate by reviewing these theories. So he starts by analyzing the Darwinian theory. The environment selects individuals according to their very slight accidental variations. Darwin does assume that variations are accidental, but Bergson objects, If they are accidental, how can they arise in every part of the organ in such a way that the organ will continue to perform its function? And this is why, according to Bergson, Darwin would assume the variation is insensible, even though this is nowhere to be found in the origin of species. Thus, variation will not hinder the functioning of the organ, I quote Bergson, and hence this first accidental variation can wait for complementary variations to accumulate and raise vision to a higher degree of perfection, end of quote. So there would be an inconsistency, I quote Bergson again, while the insensible variation does not hinder the functioning of the eye, neither does it help it, so long as the variations that are complementary do not occur. How, in that case, can the variation be retained by natural selection? The variation appears as a toothing stone reserved for a later construction. If this idea seems far-fetched, the one that innumerable variations must have been selected despite their uselessness in order to build the future again is even more implausible. Indeed, assuming that the first variation that is useless is selected, the fact remains that any variation is the result of chance. So how then can they accumulate in a progressive way until the organ develops? Because Bergson assumes selected variations to be insensible, their accumulation in the same direction seems quite inconsistent. And finally, Bergson questions how these variations, which are occurring randomly, can be preserved despite their uselessness and repeated in the same order, not only on one, but on two lineages, as the analogy of structure seems to reveal. He writes, how could the same small variations, incalculable in number, have ever occurred in the same order on two independent lines of evolution if they were actually accidental? And how could they have been preserved and accumulated in both cases in the same order when each of them, taken separately, was of no use? At the foundation of Bergson's criticism is the epistemological incoherence inherent in the idea of a long selection of variations accumulated in spite of their uselessness. Bergson understands insensible as neutral and therefore indifferent to the selection itself. This is a far cry from Darwin. Though Darwin speaks of variations so slight they're invisible, they're by no means useless and therefore imperceptible for natural selection. I quote Darwin, variations neither useful nor injurious would not be affected by natural selection. Only those variations which are in some way profitable will be preserved. So Darwin thinks of selected variations are as slight, but of real benefit. To appreciate this, one must capture the intensity of the struggle for existence, which Bergson evades. Darwin's thesis is that this struggle is of such intensity that the smallest variation apparently insensible can be significantly advantageous for the survival and reproduction of its bearer. I quote Darwin again, the slightest difference of structure or constitution may well turn the nicely balanced scale in the struggle for life and so be preserved. Concerning the improbability of accumulation of random variations in the same direction, it does address a difficulty of Darwinism. How does natural selection based on accidental variations allow the rectilinear development of organs? If natural selection certainly eliminates the most unfit, it also actively preserves individuals with beneficial variations. And this is why in Darwin, the action of selection can be said to accumulate differences of structure in certain definitive directions and to preserve all the individuals varying in the right direction. So there is no orientation of variation which occurs randomly, but there is an orientation by natural selection. Variations are accumulated towards what's best for organisms according to the conditions they live in. In addition, in Darwin, the principle of divergence, which Bergson doesn't discuss, makes it possible to explain the rectilinear development of an individual variation into a specific feature or organ. I don't have time to dwell this, but if you have questions, I'll be happy to. But the principle simply can be observed in differentiated breeding. If we select on one hand the swifter horses and on the other hand the stronger ones, the principle of divergence will be, I quote Darwin, causing differences at first barely appreciable steadily to increase, and the breeds to diverge in character, both from each other and from their common parents. And according to Darwin, this principle also applies in nature, since the most diversified the descendants from any one species become, by so much will they be better enabled to seize on many and widely diversified places in nature, and so be enabled to increase in number. One could say that the last Bergsonian argument falls on its own, as its premises are flawed. First, the variation in Darwin is not insensible. And second, with regard to the accumulation of random variation being implausible, in Darwin it's made probable by the principle of divergence. However, while in Darwin two different species may evolve in the same direction insofar as they may be facing the same environmental problems, it's indeed quite unlikely that the same variations in the same order would build the exact same organ on two different lineages. And from this perspective, it's the only Bergsonian objection that I believe remains valid. I'll come back to this argument at the end. But before that, I'll question the origin of this idea of an insensible variation. I believe this understanding is mediated by the reading of a text by Albert d'Astre, published in the Revue des Deux Mondes and called A New Theories of Species. At the time, d'Astre was a well-known figure, and the Revue was widely read by intellectuals. It can reasonably be assumed that Bergson read this article. And moreover, there's evidence that Bergson was interested in d'Astre's writing, since he referred to him in Creative Evolution. And finally, in this article, d'Astre presents a critique of Darwinian theory very close to that which Bergson would propose a few years later. According to d'Astre, if Darwin can be credited with popularizing transformism, he failed with regard to the hypothesis of natural selection. d'Astre exposes the Darwinian theory by dividing it into three assumptions. So the first, possession of a slight adaptative variation gives an advantage to the animal. Second, this variation is preserved by reproduction. And here d'Astre proposes that this variation is an acquired trait, which is not required by the Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection. Thus, I won't discuss this second hypothesis. And the third assumption is that the march always directed in the same direction of those profitable variations by accumulating managed to create a specific character. So that's the three hypotheses d'Astre thinks are the foundations of Darwin theory. Concerning his discussion of the first hypothesis, d'Astre mistakes a slight adaptative variation for an insensible one. The benefit of a slight variation, I quote d'Astre, would be too insignificant to give rise to selection. But in Darwin, as we saw, the benefit of a variation relies on the fact that it gives the organism an advantage over other for survival and reproduction. Therefore, it's contradictory to say that there would be an adaptative variation which would give a zero benefit to its bearer in its struggle for life. The third point, since we're not discussing the second, the third point concerns the principle of divergence. And here again, d'Astre's mistakes is to think of variation as insensible. According to him, I quote, variation must continue to occur in the same direction for a large number of generations in order to become sensible, since each time it's minimal. But it seems absurd that variation accumulates while waiting to become useful. Thus, he denies the gradual transformation of species by the addition of insensible variations. Like Bergson a few years later, his critique is based on the selected variation being useless. But again, where does this idea come from? d'Astre seems to attribute it to Hugo de Vries, and yet de Vries never explicitly uses this expression, I think. However, among the biologists d'Astre refers to is St. George Mivart. He quotes Mivart in a reflection on the neck of giraffes. According to d'Astre, the first slight variation at the origin of their now oversized neck would not be useful. I quote, with Mivart, we can affirm that in case of a scarcity, this advantage would be null and that it would not ensure the survival of its owner. Variation has to be considerable from the very outset in order to constitute a real advantage and for the selection process to apply to it. Quoted by d'Astre again a few lines later, Mivart does explicitly use this idea of the uselessness of variation, and even more so, the expression insensible variation. So, in 1871, Mivart published a critique of Darwinian theory called On the Genesis of Species. This idea is the same as that expounded by Darwin and taken up by Bergson. Minimal variations can't be preserved by selection if they only become useful afterwards. And he quotes Darwin, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And that's precisely what Mivart will try to demonstrate. But he too mistakes the slight variation for insensible ones. He develops numerous examples meant to refute Darwinian theory, and their analysis is always the same. Since variations are insensible at the beginning, they can't be selected. For instance, he underlined how difficult it would be to account for preservation and development of the first rudiment of limbs in higher animals, such rudiments being, on the hypothesis in question, infinitesimal and functionless. On the giraffe's neck, he explains that even if the first variation may seem useful, they would entail inconveniences such as an increase of the giraffe's weight that would ultimately make the variation disadvantageous to the survival of its bearer. But in Darwin, a variation is not selected for any supposed convenience, like reaching food, but for the actual usefulness for the animal's survival in the general context of the struggle for life. So Mivart's refutation does not reach the Darwinian theory. A variation disadvantageous to the survival of its bearer could not be preserved in Darwin. Mivart also criticizes the idea of variations accumulating in the same direction, denying, like his successors, the principle of divergence. Mivart relies on the case of mimicry amongst Lepidoptera. Here is Mivart's objection. The deviation must, in each case, be in some definite direction. But as, according to Mr. Darwin's theory, the minute incipient variations will be in all directions, they must tend to neutralize each other. It's difficult, if not impossible, to see how such indefinite oscillation of infinitesimal beginnings can ever build up a sufficiently appreciable resemblance to a leaf, bamboo, or other object for natural selection to seize upon and perpetuate. Mivart draws on another example, much more Bergsonian, the formation of the eye. He writes that these complex and simultaneous coordinations could never have been produced by infinitesimal beginnings, since until so far developed as to affect the requisite junctions, they are useless. And he quotes a passage by Joseph John Murphy in which the latter underlines the difficulties raised by the concordant results of visual development springing from different starting points and continued on by independent roads. So that's the Bergsonian analogy of structure. And this example, as with Bergson, serves to show that if it's improbable that random variations accumulate in the same direction, it's all the more incredible that the same random variations accumulate in the same way and on two different lineages. So Mivart's interesting because Darwin addressed Mivart's objection in a chapter added in the 6th edition of The Origin of Species, which I believe Bergson didn't print. It wasn't his edition. In this chapter, Darwin discusses in particular the case of the giraffe. And one of his arguments is that even small differences are, I quote, not of the slightest use or importance to most species. Therefore, the selected variation, although very slight, may turn out very useful. Despite a giraffe with a slightly taller neck will be heavier and will need extra food, the length of its neck has advantages that will more than compensate for this defect. It enables the giraffe to reach more food, yes, but in addition, I quote Darwin, and I think actually it's kind of a funny image, that increased bulk would act as a protection against almost all beasts of prey. Darwin's argument against all the alleged counterexamples raised by Mivart remains the same. He proves that the small selected variations is actually of real benefit. It allows the one who carries it to survive and reproduce better than others. Regarding the question of chance in the direction of variation, Darwin discusses the example of mimicry, saying quite simply that there is a misunderstanding of the very process of natural selection. I quote, there would indeed be force in Mr. Mivart's objection if we were to attempt to account for the above resemblances independently of natural selection through mere fluctuating variability. But as the case stands, there is none. Variability isn't fluctuant, it's guided by the very action of natural selection, as discussed. So if I resume the objections to Darwin theory from Mivart to Bergson, here are a few answers. First, there is no absurdity in supposing that a minimal variation is retained. It's retained because it's useful. And second, the accumulation of variation in the same direction is not improbable. Assuming a relatively stable environment for a certain time, it can be assumed that what's useful to one generation will also be useful to the next one. And therefore, there is an orientation given to variation by natural selection, which can explain the accumulation. And I can come back to these points in questions. So finally, we would like to return to the example that Bergson supposes a lethal to Darwinism, the analogy of structure. A Darwinian may reply that, I quote Bergson, identical effects may arise from different causes, then more than one road leads to the same spot. This is in fact what Darwin suggests when he discusses Mivart's objections. The structure of an organ in different lineages is never completely identical. In all cases of being far removed from each other, which are furnished with similar organs, I quote Darwin, fundamental differences between them can always be detected. So Darwin also studies the similarities between the eyes of mollusks and vertebrates. According to him, these resemblances is due to technical necessities. A transparent tissue and a lens are required to form an image. For Darwin, however, this resemblance is no identity. I quote, beyond this superficial resemblance, there is hardly any real similarity between the eyes of cuttlefish and vertebrates. And he concludes, as two men have sometimes independently hint on the same invention, so it appears that natural selection has produced similar organs as far as function is concerned in distinct organic beings, which own none of their structure in common to inheritance from a common progenitor. Thus, Darwin's argument is grounded in the fact that the similarity is not an identity. And this is precisely what Bergson calls into question when he studies the structure of the eye in Pecten and in men. According to Bergson, there are identical structures formed on independent lines of evolution by a gradual accumulation of effects. I must say that's actually my translation from the French version, because I didn't find in my English version the term identical, but it's identique in French. Bergson addresses the Darwinian idea that several words lead to the same place, which according to him could not apply to this structural analogy. I quote, the place reached doesn't give the form of the road that leads there, while an organic structure is just the accumulation of those small differences which evolution has had to go through in order to achieve it. Therefore, if two organs have exactly the same structure in different lineages, they must have undergone the same mutations in the same order. The same effects have had the same causes. I quote Bergson again, that two walkers starting from different points and wandering at random should finally meet is no great wonder, but that throughout their walk they should describe two identical curves exactly superposable on each other is altogether unlikely. Now, it so happens that in reality, the resemblance between the Pecten and the human eye belongs to the first case. Same meeting point, vision, but different paths taken, different organic structures. It's been revealed that the structure of the eye of the Pecten isn't identical to that of our eye. So Bergson counterexample collapses. But should the Bergsonian theory of evolution be rejected outright? Although the eye of the Pecten isn't comparable to ours, the eye of the squid does have a structure almost identical to that of our eye. So there are similar structures in divergent lineage that natural selection alone can't explain. In order to appreciate this, the homology of certain genetic processes must be taken into account. We now know that the development of organisms very different phylogenetically could involve homologous genes. For instance, Hox genes are present or have a homologue in all bilaterally symmetrical animals. They are responsible for the structures along the antero-posterior axis, both in vertebrates and in insects. if the homologous gene found in mice is inserted into a fly, it actually works. It fulfills the role played by the usual fly gene. There are similar phenomena for the eye. The development of the eye in squid, as in human, is governed by the PAX6 gene, which not only is present in cephalopods and humans, but also has homologs in Drosophila and fish. It controls the action of other genes specific to different species and whose effect is to result in eyes also specific. So there are similar morphogenetic developments in different phyla, which are reminiscent of the Bergsonian analogies of structure. It does seem that the same mechanism of eye induction may be conserved throughout the animal kingdom. Actually, if we regard the concept of the élan vital as primarily heuristic, seeking to account for a reality that the science of Bergson time failed to express, we must acknowledge its topicality. Indeed, the élan vital aims at revealing what Bergson calls a unity behind the divergence lineages. And Bergson writes, harmony is rather behind us than before. Unity is due to an identity of impulsion. It seems that these similar genetic pathways are a hint of this harmony behind. The unity of a genetic material that unfolds in different lineages. For words, according to Bergson, there is no harmony, but an increasing divergence of living forms. And I quote, life in proportion to its progress is scattered in manifestations which undoubtedly owe to their common origin the fact that they are complementary to each other, but the discord between species will go on increasing. Hence, the Bergsonian images of the upspringing and the sheaf, the movement of life is centrifugal. From the initial unity springs an indefinite multiplicity of forms. So if we follow Newman and Nussbaum-Volhard, we can actually say that the dramatic variation of eye structure, not only between vertebrates and invertebrates, but also within vertebrates lineages, should be pointed out because it expresses the fact that the same gene doesn't express the same way from one species to another, which suggests that events downstream of eye induction may have evolved independently. So to understand these variations, one must take into account their history, and that Bergson would agree on. The unity is upstream and not downstream. It seems to be that of the genetic material present in divergent lines of evolution. At least, this is what this phenomena of parallel evolution suggests. This mechanism of organ induction directed by master regulatory genes would hint at the unity of the vital impulsion. But downstream, there is a phenotypic multiplicity, which Darwin explains by the principle of divergence. The structural variations based on similar genetics must be explained both by the evolutionary history of lineages and by the individual history of living beings, their peculiar development. Therefore, the Bergsonian concept of élan vital seems to illustrate the evolutionary process fairly well. It's faithful to Darwinism from the point of view of the powdery forms that biodiversity takes over the course of its history, and it anticipates genetics by indicating the upstream similarity of certain characteristics of living beings. If Bergson's misinterpretation of the variation as insensible and his unfortunate counterexample based on the fact that would later turn out to be erroneous led to Bergson's discredit, we believe this concept of élan vital is more fertile than what the end of the 20th century might have led us to believe. So to conclude, my aim was not to point out Bergson's errors, but on the contrary was to reveal what remains relevant in his critique. And this is why I underlined that the counterexample of the Pecten, although erroneous, was nevertheless an opportunity to question weaknesses of the Darwinian theory that would later be made up for by contemporary advances in genetics. Hence, Bergson's concept of the élan vital can be credited with pointing out some deficiencies of Darwinism and with anticipating some of the advances in evolutionary biology. And as Bergson himself wrote, the vital principle may indeed not explain much, but it's at least a sort of label affixed to our ignorance. That's it.
Thank you very much, Mathilde. It was a very nice lecturer.
I actually don't know how to stop sharing my. Sorry about that. I'll find it anyway.
Okay. Okay, because now we will have some time for your questions, and if you have a question, you can raise your man or write in the chat that you would like to pose a question. So, have you some question, please?
I have a question for Mathilde.
Okay.
So Mathilde, thank you very much. It was amazing, your presentation. And I have one question, two actually. When you spoke about the misinterpretation of Bergson in relation to the sensible, insensible in case variation in Darwin, do you think that with the sensible variation in Darwin, we can think of a theological aspect, a teleological aspect in Darwin's argument? That is one question. A finalist argument as aspect in Darwin's argument. And the other question is about so Bergson has, as you mentioned, is always referring to an improbable possibility of the convergence of the insensible variations to understand these two divergent lines with such similar structures, right? And this argument is really common in not in science too, but also in philosophy. Like Paul Janet, he states the same argument, and also von Hartmann in his philosophy of unconsciousness. Actually, von Hartmann also, he makes like a math to calculate the ratio that will be possible to determine the convergence. So, I mean, the last one is more like a commentary. But what do you have to say about the last commentary and the first question, please? Thank you.
About the first question, it's pretty much the subject of my research. But about Darwin, I think there is a teleological point of view very obvious in his very first books. The writings, his writings of youth, Darwin, that haven't been published or when he was alive, but that we now edit. So there is some writings where we can find very explicitly some theological idea, but I think that he actually erased it in the Origin of Species. It's not explicit. You may find it, and Bergson finds it actually. Bergson develops this idea that the Darwinism with other theories are, without wanting it, some sort of finalisms. So, but Bergson, it's more a general thing, like if you are doing a mechanistic explanation, you believe that the phenomenon you're studying is a sort of tool that you can actually analyze. And so you have this idea that there is an engineer, but you erase the engineer and you say, oh, it's just mechanism. Darwin say that mechanism doesn't delete the engineer, it just forgets to mention it. So you can find Darwin, you can find a teleology in Darwin, obviously, and actually I think it's the main argument Bergson has against Darwin today. I think it's very strong what Bergson is saying, like evolution is not just a physical system you can put limits on. It's not so easy. It's historical, so it cannot be looked at like a machinery. it doesn't work that way. And when you look at it in a mechanistic way, then you are, without wanting it, a kind of finalist. And I think that's very strong in Bergson. But in Darwin, I think actually it's a bit more complicated, because he actually really takes into account history, and there is a form of unpredictability in Darwin, and which makes it, I think, complicated to just say, well, he's a finalist. I don't think so. I think he's more careful than that. Maybe he is, but when you read the Origin of Species, it's really not obvious. So that's for the first. For the second, yeah, I think you're right, and it's really interesting, and I'll take a look at it. But I also think it's a sort of weakness in Bergson theory, because the whole creative evolution is based on this counterexample that is not working. So it's well, it's a bit disappointing, because you read the whole thing and you think it's great. But it's a shame, because your counterexample is so wrong. So I think it's yeah, the counterexample idea that is a good way to say a theory is not working, because well, it's easy, you just have to find a good counterexample, but it's not so easy apparently. So
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mathilde. And now it's Deborah Morato who would like to ask something. No, Deborah, you should start your micro.
Now you listen me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Well.
Okay. I have two questions. One for Bruno, one for Mathilde. For Mathilde is more quickly. I think that there is a difference between philosophical theory and a scientific theory, and this must be considered when we think about this. But I understand your presentation in this direction of heuristic potentiality of elan vital that would be evident in the idea of genetic design or something like this. And so I think that you are putting this image of elan vital in the same level of other images used by Bergson, such as, for instance, the canalization that Tenno analyzed in his presentation. Is a question. I understand your presentation in this direction, but I don't know if it is this. To Bruno, I think that it's a commentary, but I would like to listen what you think about this. I think that the two forms of morality, open and closed, besides being opposite or different, are complementary. The concrete moral life is mixed, and the moral obligation stabilizes the collective life and structures the social habit. And without this, there is no society, even open or closed. And this organization is natural to men, based on the use and development of intelligence, even if the intelligence in close morality is marked or is traversed by an instinct in vitro form. So I think that the passage from close morality to open morality is not exactly the passage from nature to humanity. I think you said something like this. It's from humanity to something like beyond humanity. Bergson comments this. In any case, human life is in society develops permanently in this tension between open and close since the origin, I think. I don't know. It's a commentary. I would like to listen. Thank you.
I go first. Yeah, it's right what you're saying. thinking about the heuristic potentiality of this image, élan vital. But also, I think, I don't have the exact reference, but in the two sources, he actually says that. He says that the élan vital is it's an image who we can use to think. But he develops it in several points. I don't remember how many, with several ideas, precise ideas that he hopes science will seek further. So yes, it's an image that is heuristic, but I believe Bergson really intends to think the scientific potentiality of this image. And I really believe in what Bergson develops with this image of the aviator and the diver, the philosopher being the aviator, and who is like a pathfinder. It opens the way. He cannot like makes the road, but he can give a look at science. And in this way, and actually it's pretty close to what Claude Bernard says about this relationship between scientist and philosopher in the introduction to experimental medicine. But I think because of that, it's not just a metaphor that is useful to just like make comparison. I think there is in Élan Vital, but I didn't have time to develop everything I think about that. But I think there are several precise ideas that Bergson wants scientists to take and to research. So yes, some kind of metaphor, but not like just poetic, more than that, like really a concept he talks, I don't know how to say that in English, fluid concept, les concepts fluides. And I think it's more than just an image. It's kind of conceptual, but with many ideas. So I think it's a bit more than just an image, but well.
Okay, thank you.
So, hi, Deborah.
Hi.
It's really weird to speak in English with you.
Yes.
Yeah, but I mean, I agree with you, and I think that, I mean, it was my last point. I didn't develop that. So the relation between the openness and the closeness. But I fully believe with you. I mean, I fully agree with you. And my intention in the presentation was to emphasize the relation with the closeness, with the Darwinian debates, and also this passage from, I mean, the positive aspects of technical inventions to this kind of negative aspect of technical inventions, and the birth of the moral theme in Bergson's philosophy. But I agree with you with I mean, this mixed character of the closeness and the close and the open. But as regarding the passage from nature to human, I mean, it was not just a rhetorical question to answer another thing. It was just to close. I don't think it's the passage from nature to human. It was just a rhetorical question.
Okay.
But at the same time, I don't think it is the passage from human to beyond human. So that we can discuss.
Okay.
In private, yeah.
It's very difficult, this in Bergson's theory, I think. Yes.
It's a really good question. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And now it's Tano. You can. Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks both of you. I have questions for the two of you. So I'll start with Bruno. I really liked your overview of Bergson's philosophy of technology. I think this is something that goes underappreciated a lot in Bergson studies. I was wondering, though, about the role of concepts. Obviously, in creative evolution, Bergson likens the concept to a kind of technique or technology. He thinks that conceptuality is a certain tendency of the human mind that allows for greater traction on matter, greater action, you might say. And in that sense, it's like a tool. Of course, the concepts have a danger, which is that they reduce the complexity of the world down to how we can act on it. Like spatialization is the principle of that. But but of course, Bergson thinks that's just a tendency and we can resist it via intuition and some other things. And I was wondering how that fits into your, or how it might fit into your analysis of the dangers of technology for Bergson, whether there is analogous to the counter tendency against concepts, some kind of counter tendency against our technologies taking ownership of us in the way that you suggested. So that's my question for Bruno. And then
thank you.
For Mathilde, I, as you might imagine, have like 15 comments and questions. But I'll email the lot of them to you later. I'll try to keep it brief. So the first question is about Bergson's criticism of insensible variation in Darwin. I think it was astute of you to point out that that's a misreading. But yet I think there's still something to the Bergsonian criticism, which is that either variation is insensible, in which case natural selection can't act on it, or variation is sensible, and in that case slight variation should, say, break the functional integration of an organ like the eye. So I wonder how your reading of Bergson's misreading sort of tracks that argument. So that's one question. A second question is on Bergson's denial, on my account, of the function structure distinction. So that for him, seeing and the eye and seeing are two words, but not two things, and how that tracks Darwin's account that function and structure really are two things, so that you can have the same function arrived at through different kind of structural trajectories. And then the third and last question is when you, regarding your ending note about the élan vital as a label affixed to our ignorance, and maybe this is sort of signaling the scientific development taken by deep homology and genetic conservation and these sorts of things. This is a harder question. I'm just interested in what you think. Do you think that for Bergson, he'd ever be willing to say, like, okay, we don't need the élan vital anymore? Like, finally, the science has caught up, and the study of deep homology and conservation has given a scientific content to what I wanted to point out as a missing piece of the Darwinian puzzle with my élan vital, and we don't need it anymore, I'll retract it? Or whether it's just sort of like infinitely heuristic, like there will always be something that the science has not yet filled out. So great, thanks to both of you. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much, Tano. And before the answers, I would like to propose to extend our session for Cannes minute at least. So, thank you.
Well, thank you, Tano. So, I don't know if I fully understand your question, but the role of intuition and because as I see this relation between intelligence and intuition in the perspective that I showed now, is that in creative evolution, intelligence is a practical emancipation, right? Even if you think in intelligent concepts, it's always regarding actions. So this will be the descriptive emancipation, will be through practice. Although, on the other hand, the normative emancipation will be through intuition, through epistemological or theoretical action. They will blend instinct and intelligence in an act of intuition. So this frame changed completely in creative evolution, in my opinion, because of the war. And what happens is that in two sources, this emancipation through technology is not completely, but it's way less important. And then it enters a practical emancipation that is not through technology. So that will be my answer. And one of the things that, for example, in two sources, the intuition theme is not that present, right? So it's more the place of the mystic and the place of love. So it has this concept of love for humanity, love for all beings, So I think it has like a, I mean, there's a lot of things to say about that, but I think it's not the same. It's not like a continuity from creative evolution to sources, the way Bergson uses these two concepts. And I don't know if I answered your question, but that's it.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. Thanks, Bruno.
Okay, so I'll try to answer all of these questions. About the problem of the small variation, or it's insensible and it can't be selected, or it's sensible and then maybe it will make dysfunction the organism. Actually, the problem in Darwin is not really an issue, since if it's dysfunctional, then it's not selected. So actually, the slight variation that is selected has so much virtue. It helps the bearer to survive more, and it integrates really well. And you have to imagine it's something really rare, actually. That this kind of variation would be useful and would really well fit in the organism. But Darwin doesn't really question that, because if it hinders the organism, it cannot be selected for Darwin. So you kind of have to admit it to admit the Darwin theory. So I guess, well, it's a good question for the Darwinian theory, like how is it possible? It's like really great because it seems improbable, but yeah, it's like it works. So I think Bergson is not really generous with Darwin on that. About the question of structure and function, I think it's a huge problem in Bergson, actually, because it's not really differentiated, because in fact, matter is a product of the élan vital, which of course limits the élan vital, but well, it's some kind of compromise. And of course, Darwin is less metaphysical, so he cannot think like that. I think actually it's a real issue for Bergsonism today, because Bergson doesn't take seriously the constraints that structure can have. He admits the constraints of matter, but more like physical and chemical imperatives, but not like historical structures that may not have functions today. And I think it's really a problem. And all the more interesting since he is the thinker of duration. So he must have thought of that, like things last and sometimes they are not functioning anymore and they still exist. They don't have any function. I mean, that's for me the proper of history. And it's very interesting that Bergson has this so optimistic view that everything is a kind of progress. So yes, the élan vital, it's finite, but it's like just a reservation he makes and he's not really using it. So I think it's like a real issue. I'd love to study it. For the last question, I think if we read Bergson and we are being very nice with this text, he would say that élan vital is not needed. There is this excerpt that I wanted to find, but I didn't, in the Creative Evolution, when he compares biology to math. And he says that in math, we found a sort of mechanism that actually takes into account the continuity. And I don't remember his exact word, but he said that if we found this kind of mechanism for biology, then, well, it would work and it would be okay. We wouldn't need this image. He talks about, like, we are not mechanistic, but we think we have to change mechanisms. It's a very strange excerpt from the Creative Evolution, 10 lines. I could find it to you and send it to you if you want. So if we're generous, we say, oh, if it's found, then Bergson would stop talking about Elan Vital. But I think what he also wants to say, that since it's historical, it's always open. And since it's always open, we have to believe that the processes we identify today or in the past may not be the same as the one that there is tomorrow. So if we imagine that we can find a mechanism that could explain evolution today, from the past to today, maybe it will not work for tomorrow, because it's not the same entities, and it's not the same processes at stake. So I guess we could say that Elan Vital would be still needed. It's a bit, I kind of flaked on that. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Mathilde. That's really so helpful.
Thank you very much, Mathilde. And now we will have the last question, I think, and it's Joël Dolbeau.
Thanks both for your presentations. My question is for Mathilde. In fact, it is linked to the first question asked by Tano. It is about the slight variations. Does Bergson think that for Darwin, slight variations are insensible, or does he think that despite Darwin pretends, they cannot be sensible? And is it clear in the text? In fact, I have the same question for the biologists used by Bergson. Is this question of the possibility of the sensibility of slight variations is raised in Drost and Mivart, etc., or is it only a question to know if Darwin said this in his text or not?
About Bergson, I'm pretty sure, even though that's not like explicit because it doesn't quote Darwin, because indeed Darwin never talks about insensible variations in the origin of species. He talks about the Darwinian theory of insensible variations. So it's the expression he uses. So I believe he really thinks that's the Darwinian theory. Like, maybe it's not explicit, but actually between us, I think Bergson didn't read Darwin really well. Because if you read the origin of species, it's really hard to not see that the variation is very much sensible. But well, that's just my hypothesis. I have no idea. But I think he believes that that's maybe the implicit in Darwin theory, that variation is insensible. Because really he says that it's the theory of insensible variations, and that variation are neither useful nor harmful. So I believe it's not so clear in the Bergsonian text, but I believe Bergson thinks it's really Darwin's idea. And it's not just a consequence of the Darwinian theory that Bergson gives. About the other authors, Dastre is not, the article by Dastre is actually really not so long, and his main idea is Hugo de Vries is the best in the world. So Darwin is just like a few paragraphs, very, very clear though, but few paragraphs and not very much developed. But if you look at Mivart, it's really more interesting. It's a huge book, and there is a lot of examples, actually really fascinating, with images of whales, well, really nice to read. And he does consider that variation can be sensible. But he explicitly says, unlike Bergson, that if they are sensible, it would be really complicated that it would work in the organism. Well, Bergson says the same, but Mivart reads Darwin and understands that according to Darwin, the variation would be sensible, but he doesn't believe it. He thinks that if it's sensible, it wouldn't work. And he believes that a very, very small variation cannot be sensible because like the neck of the giraffe, a few centimeters would not change the world about that. And in case of scarcity, it would be the bigger one, the stronger ones that would resist and not just the one with a few centimeters more of neck. So he really reads Darwin, he really understands the Darwinian theory, even though he evades certain points like the principle of divergence. He doesn't talk about it much, but he just doesn't buy it. But he says that explicitly. For Darwin, it's sensible, but actually it should be insensible. But then, like he said that at the beginning in the introduction, and then it's just the theory of insensible variations all along.